Most people imagined the Black Death as a sudden medieval nightmare descending upon an already miserable and ignorant Europe. Yet the more unsettling truth is that it struck at a moment of confidence and expansion, when cities were full, trade was thriving, and families went to bed believing that tomorrow would resemble yesterday, only to wake with a heat rising through their veins so violent that by dusk they were bargaining with God for one more breath. And if you listen closely to the chronicles left behind, you can feel the shock of that first wave. Because this was not a slow decline, but an interruption, not a visible invasion, but an invisible takeover that moved from body to body without banners or armies. And within days, dark swellings formed beneath the arms and along the neck, hard and painful like stones beneath the skin, while fever blurred sight and strength drained from limbs that had worked fields or hauled cargo only hours before. And the speed was what terrified people most, because there was no gradual warning, no season to prepare, no enemy to confront, only the sudden collapse of the familiar rhythm of life into silence. And church bells rang so often that their sound ceased to mark individual loss and instead became a continuous tone woven into daily existence. And graveyards filled so quickly that new pits were dug in haste, soil thrown aside with hands already trembling from exhaustion, and streets that had once been crowded with merchants, apprentices, and children running errands grew strangely hollow, not from deliberate retreat, but because so many were gone that the air itself seemed thinner. And the question repeated in whispers from Paris to Florence to London was not merely how to survive, but whether survival itself still belonged to the human race. And here lies the first fracture in the myth of a perpetually dark Middle Ages, because early 14th century Europe was not stagnant, but vibrant. Its population nearly doubled over 2 centuries, its harvests generous during the medieval warm period, its cities expanding beyond Roman foundations, and its merchants connected by the Pax Mongolica to distant markets across Asia in a network so efficient that silk and spices crossed continents with a reliability earlier generations could scarcely imagine. And that very success created the conditions for catastrophe, because interconnectedness did not discriminate between prophet and pathogen, and the same caravans that carried wealth also carried fleas hidden in bales of cloth and sacks of grain, and the bacterium Yersinia pestis, long endemic among marmots and ground squirrels in the steppes of Central Asia, found in this expanding human web an opportunity unprecedented in scale. And when ecological stress disrupted rodent populations in the 1330s, forcing them closer to human settlements, the boundary between animal reservoir and human host thinned, and the leap that followed was not dramatic, but microscopic, transmitted through the bite of a flea whose blocked gut forced it to regurgitate infected blood into its next victim. And from there, the logic of contagion took over, because in trading outposts along the Silk Road, the first human fevers flared, and in crowded caravans, the sick shared air and bedding with the healthy, and rumors traveled westward faster than confirmation, speaking of lands in Tartary and Mesopotamia emptied as if by divine wrath. Yet Europeans heard these accounts as distant tragedies rather than warnings, unaware that the spices flavoring their meals had traveled the same routes as the disease itself. And when the siege of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula became entangled with this biological upheaval in 1346, the convergence of commerce, warfare, and infection created a pivot point in history. Because within the Mongol camps, soldiers began dying not from arrows, but from fever and blackened extremities, and bodies piled near the walls of a fortified Genoese colony that served as the hinge between overland Asia and the Mediterranean sea lanes. And in that compressed space of siege conditions and poor sanitation, the bacteria multiplied efficiently, indifferent to allegiance or ambition. And from there, ships would soon depart carrying not only frightened merchants, but rats sheltering infected fleas within their fur. And once those vessels reached ports like Messina and Marseille, the pattern repeated with chilling consistency, as dockworkers unloaded cargo unaware that the real freight had already disembarked. and the city, dense and interconnected, did the rest, because crowded housing, shared wells, and narrow streets amplified exposure. And once the pneumonic form emerged, spreading through cough and breath, the speed increased further. And here the pressure intensified, because it was not only bodies failing, but systems, with laborers dying faster than they could be replaced, fields left unharvested, food prices rising, and municipal authorities overwhelmed by the volume of corpses. And in such conditions, individual will mattered less than structural reality, since no amount of piety or isolation could halt a mechanism already embedded within trade routes and urban density. And this is where endurance became the defining human response, not resistance in battle, but the quieter act of continuing to tend the sick, to dig graves, to ring bells, to record names even as ink blurred with tears. And some fled to the countryside only to carry the disease with them, while others sealed themselves indoors, discovering that confinement offered no guarantee against an organism too small to see. And the emotional strain layered atop physical weakness as parents watched children sicken and neighbors avoided one another not from cruelty but fear. And yet markets reopened where possible, councils convened, and ships continued to sail, because societies rarely stop entirely even when half their population may be destined to die. And that statistic, up to 50% in some regions, is not an abstract number, but a transformation of landscape, labor, faith, and hierarchy. Because when so many perish, wages rise for survivors, feudal bonds strain, and long-standing assumptions about divine order fracture. And the Black Death did not simply remove lives, but rearranged power, land ownership, and social expectation across Europe. And what appears at first glance as pure devastation becomes, on closer inspection, a catalyst that forced adaptation, unsettling and uneven, but real. And the strength that emerged was not triumphant, but pragmatic, expressed in the ability of communities to reorganize under pressure rather than dissolve completely. And when you consider that those who endured did so without knowledge of bacteria or immunity, relying instead on observation, ritual, and incremental learning, the story shifts from one of blind panic to one of constrained persistence within the limits imposed by biology and infrastructure alike. And by the time the first wave subsided in the early 1530s, Europe was quieter, thinner, economically destabilized, yet still functioning. And the world that followed was not identical to the one that preceded it, because labor shortages altered bargaining power, land lay fallow, and trust in institutions wavered. But societies rarely stop entirely, even when half their population may be destined to die. And when you look back at those years now, you no longer see merely a medieval catastrophe, but a reminder that strength often resides not in preventing disaster, which is sometimes impossible, but in absorbing its impact and reshaping the world that remains, quietly, persistently, without certainty of reward, yet continuing nonetheless.
And so, when the last bells finally fell silent and the burial pits stopped filling, what remained was not victory, not relief, but a changed world moving forward on altered bones. Because the plague had not simply passed through Europe, it had rewritten it. And the people who lived on did not celebrate survival as a triumph, but carried it as a weight, knowing that what they had witnessed was proof that empires, markets, faith, and certainty could all be shaken by something too small to see. And if there is a final truth lingering in the shadow of that century, it is this quiet realization that history's greatest turning points do not always arrive with armies or proclamations, but sometimes slip silently into a city on the back of a flea. And once they do, nothing that follows is ever quite the same again.